Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on how to teach online. My name is Jeremy Williams, and I'll be the primary leader for today. And if you're just joining us, if you could start by adding your name and what you're teaching. Sorry, it just got a little loud where I am. That will stop in just a moment. I'm going to be joined in today's webinar by two amazing colleagues. Later on today, we'll have Jennifer Edwards as well as Stephanie Wiki Anderson joining in the conversation. This webinar is currently being recorded, and we're going to make this available after the fact. It will be public and available to share. Today, we're going to focus on general teaching online for all fields. And tomorrow we're going to have another webinar at the same time that will focus specifically on teaching performing arts online, some specific strategies for dance, theater, and music practitioners. As I mentioned, my name is Jeremy Williams. I am the producing director of Convergence's Theater Collective. Since our founding, Convergence's has actively worked with online and remote ways of collaborating and working and learning together. I'm also the program consultant for the Building Demand program, where I lead both online and in-person learning communities, as well as for the Building Bridges program, where I support online and web-based media and learning. And finally, I'm an adjunct professor teaching a hybrid graduate course in independent producing for Baruch College's Master's in Arts Administration. So I wear many hats, as I'm sure many of you all, or all of you all do, but those are the three that I'm really going to be focusing on today. And before we dive into our content today, I just want to welcome everyone again and invite you to get out a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen or your phone or something to write with. Just take a moment to pull that up. And I'm going to start with this prompt, and I'm going to ask you to write either a list or some phrases, some sentences, can be anything really. We're going to have a 30-second writing period, and I'm going to ask you to respond to the phrase, "How are you feeling right now?" And of course, that could be an emotional response. I'm feeling overwhelmed, a little anxious, nervous. It could also be a sensation. I'm feeling my seat in the chair. I'm feeling the warm sun coming in through the window. So I invite you to just take 30 seconds. I'm going to time us, and I'm going to put myself on mute. We're going to have about 30 seconds of quiet where you can just take a moment to reflect on this. How do I feel right now? We begin. And that's the end of our 30 seconds. If you want to just take a moment, we'll return to that in just a few minutes. As you notice, there's a couple different ways that we're going to engage today. You've already started chatting in the chat feature, which is great. We're also going to be using the Q&A feature, and I'll introduce that in just a few minutes. So let's go over why are we here today? What a change, what a rapid response moment we are in to this drastic change of moving in-person classes to online. Certainly not something that we were expecting, but here we are. And this webinar is really aimed at a practical approach to support you and how to do that. Today, we're going to talk about the different learning environments, both in-person and online. We'll go over some central questions around what can we accomplish and how can we accomplish our learning online. We're going to talk about designing for participation, facilitation. We'll share some tips and resources with you. And then at the end, we'll have a chance for Q&A. Now, that does not mean you need to wait until the end to answer your question. Because we are online, you can actually ask your question at any time. And so you can use the Q&A feature. If you do that as a public question, we can also leverage the expertise in the room. There's a lot of experts here. So you can comment and start a dialogue around these questions before we get to that formal Q&A time. But we will have that time coming towards the end of the session today. And so before we move forward, I invite you to return to your writing prompt for a moment and just look at that list of things that you wrote. And I want you to select either one word or one phrase about how you feel, and go ahead and type that into the chat now. Great. What an amazing list showing up there. A wide range of feelings and sensations as we're moving through this time together. I'm glad we're doing it together. Thanks for joining us. So we're going to first jump into talking about the different learning environments. This is a huge paradigm shift. I remember several years ago in 2009, I was walking on stage to perform in a solo show. The first time I'd ever have, or maybe probably will ever perform solo again. And as I was about to walk on stage, I was struck with this memory, or the sensation of, what are you doing? You're about to walk out here alone. You've made your whole career around working with other people. And here you're about to go spend an hour alone on stage. And in a flash of a moment before I stepped onto the stage, I remembered that I had my colleagues with me. But more importantly, I had my experience, my teachers, and my lineage with me always. Now, I share that story with you because 2 years later, in 2011, I started learning environments online through webinars and discussion groups. And I had that similar feeling. I turned on the camera and I thought, oh my God, I'm alone. I'm alone in this room. It can be a really disorienting sensation to feel the disconnect while simultaneously connecting with an audience that we're not physically with. It's a different skill set. It really challenged me to think about my own teaching skills. And of course, you have these same skills. You know, we have the ability to read a room, to adjust a plan in a moment, to turn on a dime. We can tailor class plans to meet individual learning styles and modalities unique to our students. And I really know when learning lands in the room. Suddenly, all of those skills and tools were not available to me when I moved to teaching online. Online learning is different. We don't want to get into which is better or which is worse. I think that there's pluses and minuses on both sides, but we really want to start focusing on the differences. We cannot always teach the same things online. Online teaching is not a cure-all for this moment that we're in right now. We cannot teach all things online, and we cannot teach in the same way. And so we really want to unpack some of our process together, thinking about how we share our process with you to think about and imagine your way through this really challenging transition. So with that, I'm going to invite my colleague, Jennifer Edwards, to join us. And we also have Stephanie McKee here with us. Hey, Stephanie. Hi. And I'm going to invite Jennifer to take yourself off mute and join us as we go a little bit more into conversation around different learning environments. And Jennifer, like me, wears many hats. You can see the slide here of some of the different hats that she's wearing today in this call that has influenced this. And as we're moving into this section, Jenna, are you online with us?
I am.
Oh,
Hi.
wonderful. Hi, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you. Great to see you.
Thanks for jumping in this rapid response moment.
Yes. Yes.
So Jen, Jennifer and have been in dialogue about this stuff for a long time, and we're just going to continue that right now in front of you a little bit. And I would love to just kick this off with asking you, like, what are some differences that you've noticed in teaching, from teaching in person and teaching online, because you do both?
hmm Yeah, I mean, I think, and this was going to dovetail a little bit into talking a bit about design thinking, but first, I'll just say the things that I notice about teaching online is that you don't have people's attention for as long. When we're talking about particularly shifting curricula that has been taught in person, and maybe you have an hour-long class or 50-minute class or an hour and a half class, that's too long to spend on time talking at your students. And so the biggest difference, in my opinion, is really crafting curricula that, and Jeremy and I have talked about this a lot, is really focused on the learning goals and outcomes, and that you might need to do what feels like less when you're actually in person and interacting online with folks, with students, but you need to think a little bit more strategically in terms of how you're seeding conversations, or how you're breaking them into smaller groups, or how you're engaging them in a more dialogic form of teaching. I think too, there's an opportunity here. I always like to think about the positive. So there's an opportunity, particularly those of you who are teaching, because I see we have a lot of theater folks, but we also have someone teaching anthropology and history, and leading development trainings for school personnel, which is great. I think that one thing that is forefront in my mind are what are the things that your students are going to enter the world and have to be well versed in terms of online anyway, that maybe don't get taught in the classroom, but here's an opportunity to teach them now online. So things like auditioning online, if you're in theater or dance or any of the performing arts, that's something that's happening now that a lot of students get out in the world and don't understand. Well, here's an opportunity to step a toe into that world that they might not have otherwise. Or even, what we're doing right now, engaging online, meeting online, speaking online, building collaborative teams online is something that is happening in the workforce now that often students exit university and don't have the skills to do. So I'll pause there, but because I could talk forever about this.
Well, thanks for bringing that up. Next week we're going to be hosting some similar webinars for online collaboration specifically. So today we're going to be speaking about online learning and teaching, but yes, these are amazing tools that are impacting our day-to-day work life pre this moment. So this is a real moment of 21st century being.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of 21st century being, I would like to ask you, what is design thinking? This is something we talk about sometimes, and I'd love to hear a little bit about your perspective of design thinking.
Yeah, so design thinking, I think, becomes really, so design thinking is designing anything. So I'll use a very tangible example, and then we can apply that to specifically online learning. So a very tangible example of design thinking is if you all take a minute and think about a wrench, a literal wrench. Think about what that looks like and what it feels like in your hand. A wrench is meant to tighten bolts, right? And it was designed specifically for that function. If you were to design a new wrench, your approach would not be, what is the function of this tool? How are we going to tighten a bolt with this instrument? You'd be thinking about all of the various people who are going to use that wrench. You're going to be thinking about arthritic hands. You're going to be thinking about people with different abilities or disabilities. You're going to be thinking about young people, old people, small hands, large hands. You're going to be thinking about all different kinds of people, and you're going to design from the perspective of use, not from function. And so if we think about that in terms of teaching, often, how we were taught as students from our teachers, and this is a generalization, so I'm just going to put that out there, this is a generalization, is very functional. It's how do I transmit my expertise to you? It's generally focused on me, the teacher, right? It's the function of how to serve my needs to transmit my knowledge to you. From a design perspective, and particularly, I'll talk about this in terms of online learning, you're thinking specifically about the user. You're thinking about all of the barriers, all of their constraints, all of their, for instance, a very specific thing to what I'm hearing from a lot of professors from various universities and schools and institutions is that each teacher is using a different platform to engage their students, or planning on using a different platform. So if I think about that from a design perspective, I now know that my students are having to switch not only from learning in person to online, but this professor uses Hangouts, this professor uses Zoom, this professor uses Skype. And so now all of a sudden I'm dealing with various layers of their, barriers to learning, or their comfortability with various platforms. So then when I take a step back and think about designing my curriculum from a design perspective, from a design thinking perspective, I'm taking all of that into account and really designing for the user, not for my needs. I might like to sit here and lecture at you for an hour, but that would serve my comfortability level, not necessarily how my students would be drawn to the learning process through this different doorway of learning. So I hope that makes sense. And I know we're going to get into very specific use cases later on.
Absolutely. That's such great context setting for me to really thinking about the student's experience, not what I have to teach or what I have to share. I know that, but how can I engage with the students, and how can the students engage with me within this new reality, this new virtual reality?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for kicking us off with that delicious thing to chew on and mull over. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. And so we'll bring you back on camera in a little while, Jennifer.
Great. Thanks.
Starting us off here. So we have two central questions that we're really facing right now, and which is, what can I accomplish and how will I accomplish these goals? And these are questions that we're always asking ourselves in Convergence's Theater Collective as we're making new things and designing new things and sharing and testing new things. And so, as I mentioned, we really want to share our process with you to help you in your thinking and imagining. This is more about process and pedagogy, less about specific content. So first, thinking about these two central questions, what can I accomplish and how can I accomplish them, these goals? So this first question around what can I accomplish, this is really thinking about making an asset list. And I like to start thinking, or I always make an asset list of start where you are. And we know you have a syllabus. Now we know that syllabus is probably going to change, but you do have one right now. We are mid-semester. And within that syllabus, you have also articulated learning goals. So go back to that document, look at your syllabus, look at your plan, and really extract those learning goals, both the big ones and the small ones. Write those down. Then we want to get to schedule and time. As Jennifer mentioned, your class might have traditionally met once a week for 3 hours. That's really hard online. So how much, thinking about hours of instruction, hours of homework, hours of engaged offline or via office hours and email, to really think about like what is in front of you in terms of how much time you'll be prepping, how much time you will be engaging directly with students, how much time students will be preparing, to think about all of this through in this asset sheet. And then finally, the last category to think about is resources. And I always start with resources thinking about people. Just thinking about today, how we got here today was a text message from a colleague saying, hey, can you do this? Followed by several other text messages from colleagues like freaking out. And so I sent Jennifer a message, sent Stephanie a message, here we are. we have the producing partners of Convergences collaborating on this end. So there's a lot of resources available to us and the people that we know. This is a moment we can really slow down and think about, like, well, who's my network? Who are my peers? Who are experts in the field that maybe they couldn't have come to my class, but now suddenly are available to be in my class. You know, start with the folks that you know. Also thinking about folks who you know who might have been doing this already. There might be folks that in your life who have been teaching an online class. Maybe you heard about it over a dinner party. Said, oh, that's nice for you, not for me. Well, here it is. Now it's for all of us in this moment. So reach out into your resources, into your network to think about who can provide support for you in this. So thinking about what can I accomplish before we can answer that question, we first need to know what's in our syllabus, what are our learning goals, what's our schedule and time, and then what resources are available to us. And a reminder, if at any point you have a question that comes up as we're going along, go ahead and type that into the chat, into the Q&A section. We'll come back to that later, but again, you don't have to wait for the formal Q&A time to articulate that question. So once we have this list of assets, then we can move on to this next question around the how. How can I accomplish these goals? And we have a 3-step process. First, make a plan. I love a plan. Sometimes plans can be really formal with strategic planning and graphs and charts and multimedia. And sometimes a plan looks like this on my Post-it note. You know, so, but either way, I'm going to make a list. We're going to make a plan of what happened, what's to happen. So first we'll make a plan. Next, we want to think about participation design, really designing a pathway for students to participate in their own learning experience. And then finally, we're going to think about facilitation and the role of being a facilitator within this learning experience in an online environment. So thinking about making a plan, let's dive in here for a moment. We mentioned your learning goals as you're making that assessment. Learning goals, when we're talking about making a plan, your learning goals create the structures and formats. So we really want to think about learning online in bite-sized moments, really breaking it down. In one online session, we can really get at one major goal, if we're lucky. And then breaking that down into structures and then designing formats to support those learning goals. So start with the learning goals and then start to reimagine you know, how each of those goals lay out over time. Then we want to start thinking about content. What am I teaching? And also the media. Now there's this really great moment happening where there's so many resources being shared right now. There's a lot of media to share online. I would like to caution you to slow down and not get too caught up in like, oh, we're online, we can use a bunch of media now. Sometimes media is helpful. Sometimes looking for media can take away 3 hours of your life you could have been using to really work on this plan or to strengthen the learning or just be in dialogue with your students. So, you know, there's a lot of great media out there, but we want to use that limitedly and really thinking about the impact of the media. But we do want to start making a list. Where is that media? Pulling links together. You know, when it's time to share that media, we want to have that all ready to go. To start making a list of what is the content I want to teach and what is the media that can support that. And then the last step in making a plan is really thinking about one step at a time. Once I know what we need to accomplish in one class meeting, then I ask the question, what can students do before class? Is there advanced reading? Pretty traditional. Is there advanced watching? Maybe not as traditional. Maybe there's some self-reflection or some exercises that they can do on their own to have an experience prior to coming to the online session. So really thinking through what can students do before arriving to the online class. Related to that, of course, is what needs to be available to students before class. Do I need to provide them instructions on the assignment? Do I need to provide them access to media? Do I need to make sure they actually have technology in their hands and Wi-Fi available to them. It does not do us any good if we say, watch this movie on YouTube, this clip on YouTube, if all of our students don't have access to Wi-Fi. So we need to think about making sure people have access and being able to provide that in advance. And then finally, in this one step at a time, we need to think about what needs to be communicated to students to support their learning. At this point, I'm going to direct you to the guide that we published a couple of days ago. There's some tips in there around communication, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. But you must send an email in advance that includes instructions on what people should be doing to prepare, as well as instructions on how to join your online session and what folks will need to have with them to participate. You will likely need to send more than one email to make sure that that happens. We are overloaded in email. Do not assume that it landed the first time. Students, as Jennifer said, are also in a sense of overwhelm right now, managing multiple platforms, multiple media, multiple ways of communicating. And so we really want to think about what needs to be communicated and when to students to support their learning. So after we've made a plan, we're going to move into our process design, our participation design. And in the field of performing arts and technology, there's been a great buzzword for the past couple of years, which is engagement. How do we engage our folks online? The good news is we're really just talking about participation and experiential learning when you're talking about engagement. And so when we're thinking about engagement, we really want to take this bite-sized learning that we've thought about, thinking about these individual learning goals and how those happen over time. And I really see online learning as akin to transmedia storytelling. And in transmedia storytelling, you're taking multiple points or multiple types of media and multiple platforms, stringing them together to tell one whole story. The way that's translated to online learning is that we're using multiple platforms, multiple media to arrive at one learning outcome. So we're weaving together many different strands to support different kinds of gathering, sharing, and processing knowledge and information together. It's multimedia, it's across platforms. And so thinking about participation design is really exciting from this perspective. We have a lot more options available to us. Let's start by talking about a couple of formats that we can think about to engage folks online. And these are organized from the kind of least engaged to the most engaged. And so to start with, we have traditional presentations. We can be on webcam, we can be on audio, we can have slides, we can take our presentations and put them online, no problem. Another format we could use is the fishbowl conversation, where we invite 3 or 4 folks to be on camera and to be in dialogue with each other around a curated theme or a topic or a problem or a question or response. And the rest of the class and the instructor watches and participates perhaps in chats or in polls or in other ways for this conversation. Of course, we can have a full group discussion. I will say that is really challenging. Just a quick war story. One of the first times I hosted a national webinar for folks, we opened it up for discussion and the whole platform shut down and kicked us all off. Sometimes group discussions with lots of people can overwhelm technology. So you really need to think about what technology do you have to host group discussions? How many people can that really facilitate? In my experience, more than 5 or 6 people online in a group discussion can really be counterproductive. So maybe thinking about moving into this next way of working, which is team learning or small groups. How can you break up your class into smaller groups and have video conferences and team learning that then is brought back to the full group? And then finally, this final format I want to, and these are certain, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some standard ideas. I'm sure you have more, and if you have some ideas, go ahead and share them in the chat or in the Q&A. At this point, I want to introduce my other colleague who's with us on the call today, Stephanie McKee Anderson, to talk about story circles. And as Stephanie's coming on with her video and audio, I just want to say that the performing arts have some amazing resources to help all fields with this. And this is one resource that I'd like to share with you. But before we do, I just want to do a quick intro with Stephanie. Stephanie is the executive artistic director of Junebug Productions. She, like all of us, wears many hats. She is an incredible director, choreographer, educator, facilitator, community member, advocate, activist. The list goes on. Stephanie, I'd love to welcome you on screen. Are you with us?
I am. Thank you.
Great. So continuing this dialogue, I would love to hear a little bit about, before we get into story circles, we've participated together a little bit online before, but if you could just share a little bit about how you have participated either as a learner or as a teacher in an online environment. Throwing you on the spot.
So it's been a couple of things that have been set up. I think the one that was most effective that I can remember was a session that was set up through a platform with Camille Brown, and was sitting down and talking about art and organizing and different ways that we approach that, different ways that we're in public space. That one was very, I think, very effective. We sat down and talked about New Orleans as a framework for the larger question that was asked, and using New Orleans as an example of gathering in public spaces and what that really is, what it really means. Looking at a New Orleans second line in particular, which is a procession, and something that's a part of our culture here, but looking at that as radical acts of self-care and of freedom.
That's great. So sometimes they work well, and sometimes they work okay, and sometimes it's frustrating as hell. You know, I just want to be real clear about that.
Yeah. I mean, I've been part of ones I've been part of a lot that have not worked well at all. I think one time we attempted a story circle, but it was online. It was very, very weird. Not as effective as I think it could be. I think all of the things that were shared about giving space, about not really feeling like you're talking so much, that goes to, when you're here and taking up that much space talking, it is really counterintuitive to what and how you would teach a story circle, which is about sharing space. Mm-hmm. And so that's the one thing with an online learning community that is a bit challenging, that sharing the space becomes a lot more tricky to facilitate.
Absolutely. And thanks for sharing that. And so just as a precursor, this is a form that's used in person primarily. This was not developed online for an online use, but it has been used online. I've participated in ones that have gone well and have not gone well, but there is a translation and an adaptation process to take this form online. But Stephanie, can you tell us a little bit about this form and where it comes from, and what the hell is a story circle?
What's a story circle anyway? Well, as it was shared with me, our founding artistic director, John O'Neill, was also a co-founder of an older organization, which was called the Free Southern Theater, which was founded in 1963 on the campus of Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi. During that time, they created a theater company as organizers of the civil rights movement. And as organizers of the civil rights movement, they felt like this would be a good cultural arm. And it indeed became one of many cultural arms of the civil rights movement, the Free Southern Theater. As they were coming together to create performances that were well before the time of site-specific or site-responsive works, they would turn around out of necessity and had performances, theater works, entire productions in cotton fields in Mississippi. Afterwards, they wanted to be able to have a conversation with the people who came to attend. But what John kept feeling was that the people who came to attend, they couldn't get to a meatier part of the conversation. It couldn't get past what they thought about the costumes, or, oh, we thought it was really good. He wanted a depth. He wanted to be able to engage in a conversation where people could see themselves on the inside of the work and have dialogue based on a reflection or a thought, or in some way that performance acted as a thought provocateur for the people attending. And so what he was really intrigued by at the time, this actually, one of the places that the adaptation for story circles, now we're not saying Junebug, let me just say that. Junebug did not come up and create the format of talking and sharing stories. Many people in many cultures have a history and a culture of story sharing and of the oral tradition, right? But what we did notice is that actually the Quakers were using a lot, they were doing a lot of, and continue to do, circle work. So it was an adaptation from that. And he noticed that when they started talking in a circle and sharing stories, and that's the main part of Story Circle, is the form. The form itself and the genius of Story Circle lies in its form. Its form is in the story. We find that when you share stories or metaphor rather than argument, we're able to come to points of connection a lot quicker. And he just noticed there'd be a difference in the room when people started sharing stories. When they start sharing stories, as he describes it, the room would get hot and people would say, oh yes, that happened to me. And you know, this makes me remember another story. And that fed the process. Eventually, he would continue to add to that pedagogy by adding, by learning that, hey, you can actually tell a story, a good story, in 3 minutes. And so these time limits, although I know that time is, I personally am challenged by time. I don't feel like I have enough of it. But what we did find is that by assigning these time limits, people are a lot more concise and clear. And so we found that 3 minutes is a great amount of time to tell a really great story. And so we started just adding to the pedagogy with the time, with the form of sitting in a circle, sharing time, timekeeping, crosstalk, where you're more conversational, but it allows you to have, like, be in conversation about what you just unearthed in the sharing of the stories. Asset mapping as a part of that, or storyboarding as another action that can happen after sharing those stories, so that we found that this story circle process can live in multiple spaces. It can live in community organizing spaces. It can live in difficult discussions inside community. It could live in planning sessions. That's the genius of using that form, is finding out the places that we are connected and where we are most alike, therefore being able to map out ways that we might be able to work in solidarity.
Thank you so much. You know, I always get so inspired every time I hear you talk about the origins and the development and the ongoing evolution of this form. And I want to underscore something you said a moment ago, which is depth. That this is a form that can get at depth of experience, depth of communication. And that's exactly why it shows up on this list of form for online learning. You know, it can be hard to get to that depth in a room, let alone when we are isolated and kind of connected via little boxes on the screen. So this question around how can we take a student deeper into the learning? One way we can do that is by providing formats and structures for them to share their experience. And story circles is a really great form. It can be thought of as many things, but for this use as a guide for facilitating group discussions. And Stephanie, we can share some resources out, but where can we find resources about Story Circle?
Sure, there's a Story Circle process discussion paper, which is online by John O'Neill. We also, I'm not sure if we have this on our website. We should put it on our website.
Now's a good time to update websites,
Now's
right?
a great time. I think I'm going to update the website. There's a Story Circle process and guidelines that we can also put that on our website. The Story Circle process and guidelines, I'm happy to share that with you, and you can send that out as a link if you like. We do consider this open source. We just ask that as people use and adapt and add their own pedagogy to it, that they are ever present and mindful of crediting Junebug Productions for that place of learning, following the tradition, the oral tradition of sharing the source of where you get information from.
And thank you for that beautiful reminder that part of our pedagogy is also the passing of lineage, and how great it is to adapt and adopt, but also to acknowledge the inspiration, the source, where it comes from. Stephanie, thanks so much for talking to us about Story Circles, and we will certainly share out those resources. If you can stay on with us, great. If not, we'll talk soon.
All right, thank you.
All right. I'm actually going to make a quick little change in our order here. We were going to talk about platform tools, but we were just talking about facilitation. So I want to go ahead and skip forward to facilitation and invite Jennifer back on the screen with me. And we'll go back to the platform tools in just a moment. But thinking about facilitation, you know, this is another thing that, because we have two roles in the room now suddenly, where we are both teaching online, but we're also facilitating an online experience. And for me, I must say, like, as soon as we go online, I step into the role of facilitator. I'm more of a facilitator than I am a teacher in the traditional sense in that way, in online learning. I like to think about the teaching hopefully happening in advance in terms of the preparation that the students and I are both doing before we arrive together. And then I hope to be able to facilitate a learning experience for us all together. And so just a couple of tips and thoughts when you're, after you've made your plan and thought about all of your tools for engagement and participation, you want to review that plan with two things in mind. Is it simple and is it impactful? As a facilitator, we want to make sure that things are easy for us to manage. You know, sometimes it feels like the Oz behind the curtain, where I'm like cranking all the levers and pushing the go on the slides and making sure that this is going, checking the chat box. And there can be a lot to manage on the back end of teaching online. And so trying to think about simplicity. Is it easy for me to use, first and foremost? And is it also easy for the students to use? You know, how can I craft a process that is about ease of use? Also reviewing all of the different participation and the formats and whatnot to make sure that all of the content areas and the ways that we're engaging, are they meeting our learning goals? This is one of those really important moments because we can get really caught up in like, oh, lots of new things, Q&As, polls, quizzes, video, and which are really wonderful, but those are tools. You know, the learning goal is the heart. And so all of those tools, you know, are they in line to meet our learning goals? And never underestimate the power of silence. And with that, we're just going to sit in silence for a moment. That was about 10 seconds. It can feel like an eternity when you're waiting, but silence is so important. And at that point, Jen, I'd love to bring you into this conversation at this point to jump in with me about talking and experiencing silence?
Sure. Well, first of all, I've been taking lots of notes, so I've lots of things to share. I don't feel like I want to be very silent right now, but I do think that there's always a temptation, particularly as we're shifting formats for teaching or shifting into anything new, right? There's a tendency, I think, to want to fill space and to prove either to ourselves or to our students that we have got this, right? That we can do this. And so I think, there are a number of things that I want to talk about in the context or dovetailing on silence. And one is that this is going to be a new experience for everyone. And so things are going to get awkward. They always do. Just like at the beginning of any semester, you're learning each other. Now you're learning different aspects of your students, perhaps, that didn't surface when you were in person with them. And you might be learning different aspects of your colleagues that didn't surface when you were, in space with them. So I think, first is you're going to try things. They're not going to feel right. You're going to try something else, and you'll eventually find your rhythm. So trust the process, I would say. And silence is a big piece of that, giving space for your students to actually respond. Giving space for conversation to organically arise. And I think that, I also want to underscore that just like in in-person classes, you can't force your students to show up to class having done their assignments. You can't force them to turn in everything on time. You can't, we can't, that won't magically change now that you're online. And so, when we start to talk about facilitation and different styles of teaching, the flipped classroom is one that I'm sure at least some of you are familiar with, where a lot of the learning happens outside of the classroom. Well, now the classroom is, an online portal. And so as we were kind of talking about and around offering media for students to watch or listen to before class, offering readings just like you would in an in-person class. You're probably having your students watch things outside of class as well. But because now, and I did see that there's a question here about time, about how long can we expect people to stay engaged online, and I do want to address that. I'm sure, Jeremy, you have some thoughts about that as well. But I think, the idea of allowing things to arise, when we just talk about silence and all the things that I had just pitched out into the group, I think allowing for listening is super important. And listening, as we all know, doesn't just happen with the ears. And now we don't have body language to respond to. So how else are we listening online? And so that silence can be auditory silence, or it could manifest in a break from other types of engagement. For instance, moving into a shared Google document or a Slack channel, or there are a number of different ways that we could think about sharing information that's not email. There could be an email silence because we're so overwhelmed. And these are decisions that you should make collectively with your students. And I'll talk more about that when we get into tips and tricks. So I'll pitch it back to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Jen. So important that being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I have a glass of water here, as do you. I have a glass of water. I'm in a comfortable chair. I'm in a comfortable shirt. I have a nice picture to look at, which you all can't see. I try to make the setting that I'm in as comfortable for me, because it will be uncomfortable. It will be it just will.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about that facilitation, this last kind of idea around simplicity and impact, as you're reviewing your plan for your curriculum, make sure that the assignments lead towards learning.
Yeah.
You know, that's a real big, you know, that there's a pathway that we're creating, a developmental pathway from our ideas as teachers to our instructions to students, to the experience of the student, to then how the student brings that experience to meet together. And how can we plan this pathway? How can we create a developmental pathway of one step leading to the next, leading towards learning, which of course is our ultimate goal, no matter what we're teaching. A couple of tools that might help you as a facilitator is when you make a plan, break it out into time and annotate the time. Like, I'm going to spend 5 minutes on this, 2 minutes on this. I mean, I made one today for today's. You know, I have it printed out too, which is also really helpful. Like, I print my script or I print my notes because the screen is going to be doing so many things. That's actually not for me anymore. You could just see the spread of papers I have around me right now. So thinking about taking notes and having printed materials for yourself, but really annotate each of your online sessions so you have a clear understanding of how much time each section should and will take. That being said, you also need to have a clock or a timer or a stopwatch with you. I've been using all three in this session today. I don't like a stopwatch, even though I do use them sometimes. For me, a stopwatch means, oh my God, we're racing, or my competitive pass comes in, like, oh, I gotta do it fast. Maybe not, maybe not. Maybe I just need to do it on time. Maybe a timer or a clock. So choose what's best for you, but do be aware of the time. Note the time, be aware of the time, and then also come up with a cue for transitions for yourself. How are you going to transition the group from one thing to the next? Are you going to have a saying? You know, sometimes in a loud room, we count down, we'll do clap, call and response. And there's so many ways that we gather attention. So thinking about what's going to work for you to gather attention. One simple thing I do is often just come on and off mute. And that kind of gives a little auditory shift. Oh, there's some more sound. Someone else might want to join. You know, it doesn't have to be a huge overt signal, but do know you're cueing for transitions. And Jen, do you have any other tools for facilitation like to throw in?
Yeah, I mean, I do want to come back to both the question about time and also just to add to that, and then I'll talk a little bit about other tools, but and also what Stephanie shared as well about keeping a timer and kind of having people talk for very specific amounts of time. Because just for context, so I've taught ages from tweens all the way into, you know, 60-year-old professionals transitioning careers and everything in between, graduates, undergraduates, you name it. And so when I'm talking, I'm talking about a wide range of experience and what we think of as attention span. Yeah. And it's not always the younger have a shorter attention span. Just
sometimes I have a really short attention span. It depends on the day and the moment.
Exactly. So, you know, when we talk about time, I do think it's important to pair it with what the activity is for the day. So this question of how long, you know, what's the ideal amount of time to leave someone to have people engaged online? I think it really depends. I mean, you know, if you have an hour and a half of class and you're doing something that is very much about a response to something that you had your students engage with, you know, whether it's listening or watching or reading or all three, and you give them a prompt and you say, everybody's going to talk for 2 minutes and you have to talk for 2 minutes. Like, this is a practice in kind of owning that space and talking about something for 2 minutes so that you're both teaching, you know, self-expression, public speaking, and responding to a question, you know, and actually the content of the class. Then you might go for the entire hour and a half and people are engaged and they're chatting and they're talking and they're cross-talking. But if it's not that type of format, then you might say, you know what, a 20-minute, basically lecture, or participatory lecture, is about it. And then your students take the rest of their time, that 40 minutes or whatever, to do work on their own, to watch something, to read something, to write something, to do a scene study, that they're going to then record and submit to you or something like that. So I think when we talk about time as a tool, I think and as how we're using time in our lesson planning, it's really important to think about functionality of time and engagement.
That's so perfect. And I took us back to this participation design, thinking about platform tools, because for me, these relate to time.
Mm-hmm.
The question, how long, can someone be engaged? For me, in running specific online learning communities, if there's active engagement, we can stay online for an hour, hour and a half before the fatigue really hits. An hour and a half, and like our eyes are done, looking at screens and thinking deeply. If it's passive engagement, like a lecture, something like this, 60 minutes or less, is for sure less than an hour. And one way we can extend that time, or one question we can ask is how can we make a lecture, which is often passive, how can we make it more active because we are online? And there's some real tools, and depending upon the platform that you're using, that can help with that. And so you'll see on this slide right now that there's some tools that we've been using today, such as the chat and the Q&A, but you can also run polls, you can do quizzes, you can have media, especially photos and slideshows. I will say it's never a good thing to do a screen share and stream video or audio. It never works. It's always a terrible experience for everyone and puts everyone in a foul mood. So don't plan on streaming live together. But you could all have the YouTube player up and hit play at the same time. You got to have a synchronized watching moment together. Put yourself on mute on the online platform, and then watch together and return together. But thinking about different ways we can use media and these platform tools to engage in a more active way that in a traditional classroom might be passive. And Jennifer, you have a lot of experience with activating these different elements. Would you mind sharing a little bit of your experience with that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, directed questions are so important. So, opening up a chat, for instance, and hoping that people engage with it is hard. I would really say the more, and, frankly, I learned this in in-person teaching and online teaching. If I learned pretty early on, particularly teaching things like dance history or business for a creative economy or entrepreneurship for creatives, that I had to prep them before they read or before they watched with pretty specific questions. So they knew that they knew what they were looking for, what they were listening for, what they were going into. Not that I was trying to overly direct their learning, but I knew why I was offering something to them. And it was really helpful for them to know that too. And I think online it becomes even more important, because if you want people engaging in chats, if you want people, engaging, asking good questions, and when I say good questions, I just mean questions that can enliven the group rather than deaden the conversation. I think, the more you can seed the conversation and, guide people on what kinds of questions they can respond to, or we would like them to be responding to, I think that that you can get a lot more out of simple tools like chats and quizzes, again, in person or online. And a lot of the underlying learning that you have done as teachers in person completely translate to your online experience. It's just a matter of a different type of classroom and different types of tools, but everything still translates, right?
Absolutely.
Just like sometimes you walk into a classroom and kids are cruising the internet, they're going to be cruising the internet when they have it opened and they're looking through it. You can probably actually tell more about about what they're looking at when a camera is on their face than when they're behind, when you're just seeing the back of their computer if you're at the front of the classroom. So I think, all of these questions, or all of these tools, but the thing that I find really helpful too in terms of buy-in is really polling my students in terms of usage of technology, of the platforms. It's really hard to just superimpose something that's completely new onto your students. But if you survey them, particularly now that, some of you may not be leaving class yet, you might have another week or so with your students. Use this time to onboard them to whatever platform you're using, and start with the question of, what are you comfortable using? So, create a really easy Google form or some type of survey if you use Classes or some other platform through your university. Use the tools and start to learn things about your students that maybe you've never asked before, that relate specifically to how they engage online. Because the more you can start to craft your lessons and the platforms that you choose and the ways that you ask them to engage around what they're already organically doing or used to doing for other teachers or just on their own, the more success you'll have. Buy-in is super important.
It's also a really great moment to remember that we're in this together, students and professors, that online learning is actually about co-learning, that we're learning together. This is I think maybe one of the larger paradigm shifts for me in terms of like power organization or power structures. Like in traditional settings, as the teacher, I'm the one who has information and I'm here to give it to you. Well, that's still in play within online, but there's more layers, right? I'm not physically standing in front of you. I'm not commanding your visual attention. How we work online is this. It's a great opportunity to diffuse that, where I can still be the content expert as the teacher, but we're also simultaneously co-learning how to navigate this experience together. And I think that's really exciting. So we've kind of gone into this little section of tips. We're kind of some practical, helpful tips for you. Before we jump into that, I just want to do a quick recap. We had two central questions. What can I accomplish and how can I accomplish these goals? These are our guiding questions in making this transition from in-person to online. And then, making what can I accomplish? Make sure to make your asset list, syllabus, learning goals, schedule and time, resources available. And then this 3-step process, making a plan, designing participation, and making your plan for facilitation, your guide for facilitation for yourself will answer the question of how will I accomplish this? So yes, this can feel like a lot, but really it's just 2 simple questions, what and how. And then there's a lot of testing and experimenting and learning along the way. And just a friendly reminder that, we're gonna fail, but let's fail forward. Let's fail and learn. Let's fail and try to actually have a little bit of humor about it with us, because sometimes technology does not work and all we can do is laugh. Otherwise we start to pull our hair out. I do anyway, let me say I. Sometimes technology fails and I want to pull my hair out. Maybe you're more zen about this than I am. So as we're heading into this tips, a reminder, go ahead and type in your questions into the Q&A or into the chat. We're gonna move into the Q&A section in just a moment, right after these tips and resources. So Jen, you wanna kick us off with you've shared some amazing tips with us today along the way, thank you. But I'm wondering what you have top of mind where we are right now, like some practical tips on hosting online experiences.
Yeah, I think, honestly, what I just shared about kind of polling your students and really learning about them is super important, because I personally have seen this happening, and I've talked to a lot of colleagues and they too have seen this happening digital natives are maybe not as able to organize as online resources as we might have hoped that they could. And so I think, one thing for me, whether it's in person or online, really taking the time and kind of, we've talked a lot about planning. I would make the recommendation, if I can be so bold, is to look at the rest of your syllabus and say, what is absolutely crucial that we cover?
Yep.
And what can I kind of let go of or fold into something else? Because there's going to be a period of learning that seems like it has nothing to do with your syllabus, that is much more about making this transition into this online environment. Because they're going to have to, like I said, organize themselves differently. Maybe receive information at a different level. Before they might have said, oh, I saw that email, but I'm going to see, Professor so-and-so in class tomorrow. I'll just ask them about it. Well, now the only way they can ask you really is to email you, right? There's no, 15 minutes before class or stop into your office or something. And so, bringing them into the process of, like, as Jeremy said, co-learning is super important, and giving space within what you have to get through in the next several weeks for that learning and for that conversation and dialogue is super important. I can't stress enough how gaining students' buy-in to what you're about to engage with will serve you really well. And just kind of superimposing, like, we're going to use Hangouts and this is how we're going to do it, is really hard when you're not in person with someone. It's super hard when you're just kind of trying to reach through the screen and grab people and have them give you their attention. So I think the biggest tip for me is, however you would do it in your own way, whether you still have a week left and you can do it in person, or whether you start to have, whether you dedicate the first 2 classes online to this kind of deeper dialogue and surveying and onboarding of your students, I think it's kind of tantamount to the success of making the transition.
That's great. Thanks for that, Jen. And it's so true. It is tantamount to the success. I'm going to share one practical tip in that we're now using our homes as our workspaces. And staging. I've been leading online communications in different places, and one colleague and I, we used to joke, like, we need to design these backdrops. So, like, you can't tell that I'm in a hotel room, or you can't tell that I'm out at a park, or you can't. So it kind of looks the same, but it's not. We didn't do that. And you are now moving your teaching into a non-institutional space, whether that is your personal living space, a home office, another space. We're going to be working out of many, many spaces. I would encourage you to be mindful of what's in view on your camera. Maybe there's a pile of clothes that needs to be put away. Maybe that doesn't need to be in the shot. Think about that a little bit. Also, a reminder that you're asking, especially when you ask your students to come online, you're asking them to reveal their private spaces. I always ask for people to be in a relatively quiet space, when participating online. But that might mean that there's maybe younger children in the background in the house, or maybe they're at work. We actually don't know. We have no control, and we don't know what environments folks are going to be in. So it's really important to, one, be aware of your own physical environment, what's behind you, and also if you're screen sharing, close everything on your computer except what you're going to use. You don't want to accidentally show your grade sheet. Whoops. You don't accidentally want to show your email to your mom that you're working on about why your mother shouldn't freak out about the coronavirus right now. There's many things that we're now sharing space, most personal and professional space. And so just to have an awareness of that we're no longer protected by our institutions in that way. And we have freedom. We can do it from our couch. Yay. Prep can be like, oh, I don't need to commute 3 hours, an hour and a half there, an hour and a half back on the subway. I can go make a cup of tea. That's my commute, is to the kitchen. So there's pluses and minuses with all of this, but do keep in mind that this is a different paradigm, that your personal space will be in view of others, and that others' personal space will be in view of you. And so that's really important to keep in mind. So I see we have quite a few, we have some questions coming in, which is great. And we have some time for those. How are we doing on time? Yes, we have some time. I'm gonna relax about time for a second. I was worried about having enough time for questions. So I have we have questions. I want to point to, there's questions coming into 2 different places, and your students will do this too. I actually directed everyone to put in questions in the Q&A feature, which is what it's intended for. But some folks are putting it in the chat, which is great because you're engaged. So I don't want to say, no, you're doing it wrong, but as a facilitator, I now need to look in 2 places. So that might be true for you as well when you're working with students. You might give them a really clear instruction, oh, put it in this place, but they put it in another. So that's another tip. Make sure to look in multiple places when you're asking folks to engage. Assume they are, and that you can't find it. Don't assume they're not engaging. So I'm gonna start first in the chat window because I had that up in front of me. And so Shanna asked, for how long do you find people stay engaged online, and what's the regional time limit? We've touched on that a little bit. Jen, do you have any follow-ups or more specifics you want to add to that?
No, I mean, that was the question that I was specifically responding to. I do really think it's about the activity and how long it should take. I do see, or how long it could take, or students could stay engaged. I also wanted to note that from Liz, she's saying that she's required to teach her regular class, which is 2 hours and 50 minutes, 50 minutes, with a 15-minute break. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that a lot of your universities may be requiring you to, and I'm putting that in air quotes. And so I think that the reason I put it in air quotes is because, yes, your university is going to say, hey, this is in your syllabus, this is what we contracted you for, this is what you agreed to do for your students and with your students. But I also wanted to not be too rebellious, but also say, well, now you're entering into a different conversation with your students. And I think that this should be something, or could be something, that you talk with students about. Maybe you have breakout groups, maybe especially if it's a activities-based class. If you are doing scene studies, if you are doing creative work, maybe you divide the group in half, and maybe half the group can watch, but you're actively working with half the group for half the class and the other half the group for the other half of the class. I don't know, I'm just kind of spitballing, but I think it's important to think about this realistically, and not just what is you're being told to do, but how this can actually work in service of your students.
And I'm going to add to that and say you could also think about how to subdivide 2 hours and 50 minutes in multiple units, right? So again, if we're really breaking down that time, we don't need to spend all of that time together online. We also don't need to spend all of that together, that time online. You could give an assignment and say, we'll meet back online in 15 minutes. Go and work on that, and let's meet back. So thinking about how can you, if your university is saying you must work within these hours, okay, but how can you move in and out, being on and offline during those hours? You don't have to be in the same format together. And this is where thinking about your participation design becomes super important. If you have almost a 3-hour chunk, like that is not easy. We're going to get into a little bit more details on that kind of strategy tomorrow, specifically for the performing arts. But we can all take the strategy of subdividing our time and breaking it into smaller bite-sized pieces that are actually digestible, because 3 hours online is not digestible. A follow-up question is around encouraging people to show their faces, particularly in discussions. It's hard not to have the facial body language, but I get people may feel uncomfortable. What are your thoughts? Great point about revealing private spaces. I hadn't thought about that. So in the same way, so again, it's about comfortability. You know, I have to teach people how to be comfortable on camera before they're uncomfortable on camera. That means I often have to model myself kind of being a fool, or like, what does it look like? Like, this is what it looks like when I'm responding to a text message. Oh, you can see that? Oh. Thinking about where your eye focus goes. Right now, I have Jennifer's video to the right. So when I want to look at her, I look at her to the right. But that doesn't, you don't know what I'm looking at. So having a more relaxed presence, not being concerned about the camera, thinking about the camera as an eye rather than a camera that's picking up your field of perception to share with someone else. You don't need to speak directly at the camera. You can, I'm often caught on camera, like looking up, imagining, thinking, dreaming. This is my posture for that, you know. You don't need to change that. This is not suddenly an on-camera moment. And so giving a little instruction, and we can provide a guide for that later in a couple of days about how to prep your students to be more comfortable on camera. But that is a moment that you're now responsible for doing as the teacher, is to getting them comfortable. Jennifer, do you have any follow-ups or additions to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the one thing that I often try to think about myself, but also I'm very transparent with students about, is that, yes, this is uncomfortable, right? But again, and we touched on this a little while ago, whether you're an actor or an engineer, the reality is that you will very likely interview for a job online at some point. And so, yes, in this moment, this might be uncomfortable, but you're teaching multiple things in this moment, right? You're teaching that, or you're offering opportunities for them to practice things that they will undoubtedly be forced to do at some point in time. And so to me, it's like, isn't it great to have the opportunity to get comfortable here in a classroom setting before your livelihood is dependent on it, or your first job or your last job or whatever is dependent on it. Also, I often kind of, again, this is about the onboarding process. Like, how many of you FaceTime with your friends or your boyfriend or girlfriend or grandma or mom or whatever? This isn't that different, and so there are a lot of things that our students are doing all the time, every day, and not thinking about. And this just feels different or awkward because it's a classroom setting. But often, again, they're doing it all the time anyway, if they're posting TikTok videos, if they're Snapchatting, if it's like all the things that they're like, oh, I don't know how to do that, or I'm uncomfortable doing that. But often they're doing it anyway. It's just in a different context. So I try to have that conversation really upfront at the beginning of a class. Like, yes, this might be a shift in how we meet for classes, but it's probably stuff you do all the time, and it's stuff you're going to be asked to do anyway. So.
Well said. So our next question is around advice. We're getting into some more creative and performing arts, which is great. I mean, that's who's with us today. Great to have you always. So this next question is around how to approach creative activity, for example, studio work, and this is coming from a visual arts practitioner. How do we approach a creative activity online? Do you create a break and then people go off and practice and then come back? Or are they create a work and then come back? Or is this something that happens completely offline? And I have a lot of thoughts about this that we'll go into tomorrow. But broadly, what I would like to say is that I think when we think about arts teaching, whether it's visual or performance, there's technique teaching, and then there's the path of the artist or creative process thinking. It is really hard to teach technique online. It is not really hard to support artists developing critical and artistic and problem solving and creative skills. And so again, we might need to think about like, well, if it's traditionally been a studio class where we're, I'm going to say painting a painting. Yes, painting a painting can still happen on their own, but what can happen when we're together? And that question is really important. And we'll dive into some more strategies specifically on creativity tomorrow, but what can happen if it can't be, if you can't, maybe you're teaching pottery and you don't have a wheel at home. How do you model that? I don't know. But we'll brainstorm that a little bit tomorrow as well. Jen, do you have any thoughts on approaching creative activity online?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what you've shared, Jeremy. I think that particularly given the world today, a lot of, critique is offered online. A lot of, I mean, I think about, particularly when I think about dance and theater, I've been a part of or written about a lot of processes that happen. For instance, I'm thinking about Netta Yerushalmi's piece where she was in New York and half of her company was in Israel. And they created the entire piece over Skype, right? So again, I kind of keep coming back to what is active in practice in today's world at large. When they step outside the university, they are going to have collaborators across the ocean. And now most creators are using technology. I know sculptors who are fabricating in virtual reality and then downloading those models into 3D printers and then casting from those 3D printed pieces and then creating off of that. There's this melding of technology with the visual and performing arts that often students don't have the opportunity to even imagine until they're outside of the university setting. And so again, I know that this might sound like, oh God, now I have to think about that. I'm used to like going into a studio and teaching my craft and, but I do think that particularly given this is half a semester, like how can you blow your students' minds in terms of what is out there,
and how can your students blow your mind out
right,
there, right? That it's actually about dialogue in this moment.
Yes.
It could be, it doesn't have to be, but it very well could be about dialogue, which is a very basic form of learning.
Yeah. And so much of an arts practice is about comfort with ambiguity, whether that's in terms of work and job and finances, or in terms of creative practice and, always stepping into the unknown. And this is, as scary as it might be, this is that in practice, very much so.
Mm-hmm. And it is let's not shy away from like the feeling of fear, right? We don't need to fix that, but there is an antidote, which is like dropping into process, trusting our experience, reaching into our communities. But the fear is real. It's not manufactured. This is new. I often find that line of like fear and excitement to be like that fine line. It's like, if I'm feeling the fear, I try to tip myself into excitement, but if I can't, I just need to feel a little frightened for a minute. And that's okay. That's okay in these moments. There's no need to emotional problem solve on top of technology, problem solving technology and learning. We're problem solving a lot right now. And so just a reminder to be kind to yourself in this, that there's not one right way. My producing partner, Liz Stanton, always says there's many right ways to do one thing. And there's many, many right ways. And so this is a chance to start exploring some of those ways. Which transitions us a little bit into this next question around this question about feeling a loss at how to build an online bridge toward keeping a scene study class going when we cannot be in the room with each other. And you're right, we are going to talk about that tomorrow, but scene study is not the only class where folks need to talk to each other. People need to talk to each other in biology labs. People need to talk to each other in engineering. Luckily, we have lots of fields where folks need to talk to each other. And so this is one of those moments where we're going to need to be creative in both what do you have available to you, how can they speak to each other, and then also, you know, what needs to happen in groups, what can happen one-on-one, what can happen in small groups. You know, I don't want to ignore that the one comment about, you know, my university says I must do it in this way. Okay, well, it'd be nice to spread that out across the week, those 3 hours of instruction. But if you can't, like, you know, try to think about formatting a little bit differently. How can we come together? You know, maybe they can talk on the phone. Maybe they can FaceTime. Maybe they can text. I don't know. There's many opportunities, but there are ways to build those bridges. But they feel different. I want to just acknowledge that we don't get I do not get the same satisfaction of coaching an actor online as I do of coaching an actor in person. It is not the same. The connectivity is not there. I have to trust so much more because I'm not getting that feedback, that physical feedback, the energetic feedback in the room. It's like, okay, I'm working with a student who's confused. If they say they got it, I have to trust that they get it. You know, there's a trusting of the experience that has to come into this. But I think knowing the way that many theater practitioners think about making connections, you know, in the room, you know, how can we translate that? You know, sometimes it's about getting to know each other. Well, maybe we're not doing scene study from an acting perspective. Maybe we're doing scene study from a get to know each other ensemble building, or even a dramaturgy way. That could be physical dramaturgy or, you know, research. This is a great time to do research and self-exploration, no matter what your field. It's a great time for research and self-exploration, and then reflecting back about that exploration and reflection. Jen, do you have any thoughts on building bridges?
I mean, I think that you covered that. If it's okay, I might move on to the question about.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So, question is about. So this person's students are currently on spring break early, so they'll be gone for 2 weeks, and then they're expected to start right up with online learning. I would, and you know, the question is, how do we begin to get that up and running before they all meet online, without any further personal contact? This is just how I would approach it, but I would offer several times for a conference call and get your students chatting together and with you about how to then move online. And the reason why I'm saying conference call and not an online meeting, which you could do easily, is I think it's a step in, right? We're not yet all having to show our faces online. It's a little less formal. You can do it pretty easily. They could take the call on the beach if they are so lucky to get away for their spring break, or, you know, from wherever. But I think that it's a way to start the conversation without the formality of meeting for class. And if you say, you know, I'm available these 3 times, and you send out either an email or a doodle poll or something that allows people to share when they're available or how they slot into those various times that you offer. And then you just start the conversation. That's personally how I would approach it. Not more email, not more, to get people talking and really, really simple and group oriented, but low barrier to entry.
And that dovetails beautifully into our final question that has been asked and that we have time for today, which is, how do we prompt, I'm curious of what, if any, of your experience in terms of conducting a conversation with each other, not just to me, crosstalk, right? Yeah, it's so important in the learning environment. I'm thinking about having a prompt around the students can swirl, how can have partners. Exactly, like partnering people up, You know, again, thinking about if you do that assessment of what students are what platforms and technology students are currently using, like everyone's going nuts for TikTok right now. You know, like if they're on TikTok, like let them talk on TikTok. Like if they're like, maybe ask them, how do you want to communicate with each other rather than dictating that? You know, sometimes we have to dictate, you use this platform. Other times, let them problem solve that for themselves. How do you, like, throw that question back to them? How are you communicating with each other already? What are your preferred modes of communication? I mean, that's something I always ask a new client. There's so many ways we can communicate now. You know, so I think that's a great question, and one that you can absolutely turn back to your students and say, how would you like to communicate and how are you communicating?
Mm-hmm.
So we have come to the end of our time today. There's one more question about how do I register for tomorrow's webinar. We'll send a link out for that. It's also all on our Facebook page on Convergence's Collective, Convergence Theater Collective. And it's also in our field guide. I'm not quite sure how people have found their way here today. We're so excited that you did find your way here. Just a couple of wrap-up things in terms of resources. We did publish, CTC published an online guide to support you in designing and hosting your online classes and learning experiences. Today's webinar is going to be recorded and it will be made available to share. And we also have, as we mentioned, there's a ton of resources popping up. Check on Facebook. I'm now in 3 different groups that are now just like rapidly sharing all of the, I'm kind of overwhelmed in the amount of amazing resources. I feel like I now have enough content to teach for 10 years, if I ever have enough time to actually read through them all. And then finally, Convergence's Theater Collective is offering a training for faculty. So if you and your faculty need more support, have your department, or you can get in touch with us, but we are happy to provide a really robust and thorough training to help you translate your lesson plans, your class plans from these ideas into practice, in rehearsal and practice settings, and into your online experience. We are in this kind of interesting moment of spring break. We are setting up some trainings during this time. And so we're happy to support your faculty. Unfortunately, we can't do one-on-one right now, but if you individually need support, take this resource to your dean, to your chair, and say, please, here's a resource, I'd like to do it. Get in touch, and we will make it happen. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I want to say a big thanks to Jennifer Edwards.
Thank you.
And also to Stephanie McKee Anderson, who popped off. It's great to be in dialogue with you all in real life, but also online. And thank you for adding your expertise and experience into this fast, rapid, and adaptive response. Best of luck to you all. And we'll see some of you online tomorrow, hopefully, but if not, sometime, somewhere soon, as we are now all online together. So have a great Friday. Bye.
Bye.